side by side in the middle of central Hawke's Bay. So I live in a little district called Oiroa, and Kelly lives in a little district called Wanstead, so Flemington. So we live close by, but we are literally in the middle of nowhere. So it's amazing that we can we feel pretty lucky that we can hopefully share our wisdom with you all today from our little wee tiny country communities that we live in central Hawke's Bay. So first of all, thanks so much for giving us some time today, and it's really really great to see you all. We are recording this, so if you need to drop out at any stage, that's totally fine. We know that people have to come and go, so just know that we are recording it, and we can send this through to you or to any of your colleagues. If you're wanting to share it around your organisations, please just let us know after the webinar. Happy to send it on. Second thing to note is you're all on mute, but we are keen to have your feedback, and we are keen to make this interactive so it's not too boring. You don't want to listen to Kelly and I all the time. So how are we going to do that is if you can just put some questions up in the chat, and we'll do Q&A towards the end. So yeah, keep the questions till the end if you like. And then the other thing to say to you is that for some of my Funding HQ members, you'll know that I decided a wee while ago that I wouldn't just do the webinars on my own. It's really, I think, be more interesting for my Funding HQ members to hear about other organisations that work in a similar way to Funding HQ that are working in the community sector. So Kelly reached out to me from B Collective, who do a huge amount of work in the voluntary sector. And I thought it would be really useful today to talk to Kelly and ask her some questions about the services that they provide, what she's seeing in the voluntary sector, because actually the volunteers in a fundraising capacity are often they're not ignored, because of course you're incredibly important people and you're part of what keeps your organisation going. But often the role that volunteers can play can be often overlooked. Not intentionally, but that can happen. And what I wanted to do today was to talk to Kelly about how we can better think about how we work with our volunteers, how we can measure the impact that the volunteers have in our organisations from a funding perspective. So that's how we're going to run it today. But before I sort of kick off, I also just wanted to say to those of you who are on here who don't know me, I'm Jenni Giblin, and I'm the Director of Funding HQ, which is an online fundraising capability building program. So we work with organisations large and small all across New Zealand, helping them to be more successful with their fundraising. And for those of you who aren't part of our membership, just so that you know, there's three simple things to being successful with your fundraising. One, how to tell your story. So how do you tell your story in a way that's going to mean something to is going to demonstrate the impact you're having in your community? That's the first thing, getting your compelling case right. The second thing is making sure you have a diversified funding plan. That's so important, particularly in the post-COVID environment we're working in now. And thirdly, it's how do you look after your partners once you get them on board? So if you can tell your story and you can have a diverse funding plan and you're not having all your eggs in one basket, and then you look after your partners, that is a recipe for success with fundraising. It doesn't have to be overthought. And what's happening a lot that I have noticed, fundraising in the last 3 years has changed significantly, and even again in the last 6 months. And what's happening in New Zealand at the moment from a fundraising perspective is that a lot of the funds that organisations have traditionally relied upon, such as lotteries, which has been a great funder for community projects throughout New Zealand, their funds have shrunk by 30%, which is a huge impact for our community groups. So I know lotteries are undergoing a review at the moment about how they distribute their funding and where their emphasis is going to lie, but they are down 30%. I think it's also very fair to say that the gaming trust sector is also down. So those of you who have had strong relationships with the gaming trust sector, where you've been able to get money each year from your gaming trust, it might be a little bit harder for some of you now. It may not. It just depends on when you apply and what you're applying for, etc. But definitely their pool of funds is shrinking. And the other thing to sort of add into this is that from a local government perspective, there are many councils across the country at the moment that are really looking at their budgets and trying to determine how much have they got to distribute back into their community for community organisations. So for some councils, they are closing down, or they are reducing the amount of money that they've got to distribute to community organisations. So I guess now more than ever, it is really important to think about making sure you have a diversified funding plan, thinking about what you can do with corporate partners, thinking about philanthropic approaches, thinking about regular giving, because those traditional sources, while still there, they are, they have less to distribute. And of course, there's more and more organizations looking for funding. So it's a more competitive environment. So that's kind of what I'm seeing happening over the last 6 months. And particularly what I'm noticing is for some organizations who were given money throughout COVID to sort of keep them going, a lot of those organizations now are really struggling to sort of find the ongoing operational costs to keep going, now that COVID funding has disappeared. So it's a really interesting time out there. I mean, that all sounds very doom and gloom. So on the positive note is that, there are still funds out there for sure. And there are still businesses making donations. And we still have a very philanthropic community here in New Zealand. So there is definitely money out there, but probably now more than ever, it's just thinking about how you identify your compelling case and tell your story, how you have a diversified plan and look after. And part of all of making that successful, of course, is your volunteers. So we're going to cover that off today. That's my big, long introduction to Kelly. So welcome, Kelly, and thank you so much for reaching out to me. I think it was about 3 months ago we connected.
Yes, I'm so delighted. I'm really excited that this has happened. And small world, I'm learning quickly that New Zealand is kind of, always 2 degrees of separation with someone. So we had a mutual friend and then found out we were actually neighbors. That's always how it goes. So yeah, I'm delighted, and just find, even in kind of what you're saying, we found so much synergy in our kind of views about, how to support organizations. So yeah, I think this is going to be a really good chat. So for those that don't know me, which most of you won't, I'm Kelly Vogel. I am the Community Development Manager with Be Collective here in New Zealand. But we are actually present in New Zealand, Australia, Northern Ireland, and the UK. So we kind of have, a presence across the globe, and I work with our clients overseas as well. So as Jenni mentioned, I'm based here in Hawke's Bay, which is funny, being in a very, very remote rural community, but being really connected. It's such a gift. So really appreciative. But I guess maybe sharing a little bit about my background and where I've come from. Obviously not a Kiwi, although I'm slowly becoming more and more that way every day. So my background is actually more of the culture and arts space. Always have been really, really closely embedded and passionate about community-led projects. Back in my earlier years, I was a musician and devoted a lot of time to growing the kind of arts sector. I have a master's in cultural policy, and that really led me to that kind of idea of how do we enrich culture? How do we enrich our communities with community-led projects? So I worked on a lot of festivals, worked in kind of that music promotion space, but always with community in mind. And then when I moved to New Zealand about 4.5 years ago, I got embedded into the culture here in Hawke's Bay and worked as a contractor with a lot of nonprofits and charitable organizations, doing everything from communication to fundraising to volunteer coordination and management to kind of strategic planning. So it's really evolved, and I'm really grateful for the journey I've been on. I find that, community organizations have so much soul. They offer our lives so much. And so I always want to be connected to that space. So I found a really, really wonderful kind of combination of passion and skill with Be Collective. And now I work, across sectors. So we work with charitable organizations as well as corporates and councils, schools, really anyone that's involving volunteering in their programs, to kind of think more strategically about, how do we work with volunteers? How do we measure their impact? So Be Collective at its kind of simplest form is a volunteer management and engagement platform. But what we're really trying to do is look at the problems that we're seeing in the social sector and beyond, and think about how can we work together? How can we kind of be a bit more resourceful? How can we kind of cross-pollinate and share resources, share our people, work smarter, and hopefully remove some silos? And Be Collective is really all about finding a space to do that and fostering collaboration. So that's a little bit about us. That's our spiel, and that's a bit about me. So you can kind of get a sense of where I come from. So yeah.
Oh, thanks, Kelly. I was quite interested to hear from you about what is going on in the volunteer sector at the moment. What are there any sort of trends that you're picking up on in the volunteer space at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's my everyday kind of breathing, eating, speaking about volunteering. And so, we are seeing a lot of changes. Obviously, COVID played a big role in the way in which people were able to be involved. It was a really eye-opening experience. But I think the primary shift is kind of moving away from some of those long-term commitments when it comes to volunteer involvement. We're seeing a lot more sporadic, episodic, project-focused volunteering. We're also seeing, unfortunately, and this is true in New Zealand and across the globe, we have an aging volunteering population. Our kind of workforce in that space is contracting. So we're losing volunteers as well. So it's an important time to think about, as we're seeing these shifts in the way that people behave, how they like to give their time, but also some of those, challenges about, are we going to have a volunteer workforce in 20 years' time? There's no better opportunity than now to start thinking about the future when it comes to volunteering. Yeah.
It's really important, and it's something probably that everyone on this webinar is probably experiencing as well, is that there can be a lot of burnout, can't there, in the volunteer sector, and as you say, an aging volunteer base. And it's so important to try and encourage younger people to get into volunteering and supporting these organizations. I know from a fundraising perspective, with the groups that I work with, Kelly, often we talk about when they're about to start raising some funding, we do often talk about what is how much money has that particular organization got to contribute towards, a project they might be doing or their ongoing operation. So what do their internal finances look like, and how much do they have? But yet we often don't talk about actually what is the impact of the volunteers that we work with. And so I know with some of the funders that organizations I'm working with apply to, they are actually really interested to understand, well, what does the volunteer capacity look like within your organization, and how do you measure that? So I guess that's, time and input and skills that come to the table. Do you see that happening a bit in organizations where sometimes the role of volunteers is overlooked? Is that something that you come across?
Yeah, it's really common. And I think some of that comes from maybe a lack of knowledge, or maybe feeling like a lack of time to be able to really identify, the role that volunteers are playing, or how significant that role is. In New Zealand, it's really important to think about the value of volunteering. In terms of their contribution to the economy, something around 4 billion a year.
Really?
We've got over 115, I think, nonprofit charitable organizations here in New Zealand. 89% of those operate with zero paid staff. So you're thinking about kind of the services, the kind of service providers that we know and love, the organizations that bring a lot of joy to our lives. You can probably think of organizations in your specific community that have made a huge impact on you. Chances are, they're highly reliant on volunteers. And so it's important to understand that context and how important they are specifically to our country. There's something like 159 hours of volunteer contribution a year. Across sport, I think it's 3 million hours a year devoted in volunteer effort. So it's a massive contribution.
Yes.
And yet we're finding that organizations find it really challenging to talk about their volunteer impact, their volunteer culture, the kind of various desires and aspirations of those volunteers, what drives them, what motivates them. Unfortunately, I think with a lot of organizations, and I've been there personally, in roles where you are feeling burnout or you're feeling stretched, it can sometimes feel like another thing to prioritize. But as we start to look at their impact and the ways in which they support us, which I think we'll continue to talk about today, but it's really, really essential that we actually are taking notice of those things and using some intentional frameworks to measure their role in our organization's success.
I think that you're hitting on something really interesting there, Kelly, because if organizations have the ability to measure, even just thinking about the hours that they are working, or their volunteers are working, that actually is part of the story. That is part of what they are delivering back to the community. But it's also part of when organizations are thinking about their contribution and how many hours they've got to that have been contributed. The ability to account for those hours, put a cost against what those hours would be, would also be really helpful from a funding perspective when they are pitching into a funder to say, hey, look, we've got X amount of dollars in the bank, but we have 150 hours per month that's been contributed by a volunteer sector, and they're enabling us to not have to pay for admin people or whatever it might be. So that I think one thing I'm keen to encourage my Funding HQ members to think about is making sure that that is measured and that is put forward as part of any application going forward, to sort of say, hey, this is what our volunteers do. And I guess I'm just thinking about that initially from a financial perspective, but you're sort of talking further about, well, actually, what does that mean for the volunteers, and what does that mean for them in terms of social connectedness, keeping their skills going, all those other things that can that are I guess intangible benefits that volunteers bring to a community.
Yeah. And I mean, often, when we talk about overlooking their impact, it is more than just hours. Skills is a really good example there. I mean, chances are, if you're a highly reliant organization on volunteers, they're bringing something to your organization that you need, whether that's adding to your culture, maybe it's an expertise in an area. I think this is really a great example in the sporting sector. You've got all these coaches with years of experience, managers with years of experience of leadership, of kind of instilling teamwork, instilling, the love of the game. That's, just one of many examples, but you need those people around that have that expertise to see your programs really succeed and thrive. Not only do they have an economic contribution, they've got a massive contribution to, the values you're trying to reflect onto the community. Often our volunteers know so much about the inner workings of an organization. So we really just can't emphasize enough the role that they play in making sure that organizations have a place and have a future. When we talk about other kind of resources that volunteers bring and adding to that real wealth of your organization, their networks as well. They're bringing people along with them. And chances are, if you have a growing volunteer base, it's because of that word of mouth and sharing the kind of benefits that they've experienced firsthand. So yeah, again, the kind of worth and value there is really endless when we start to kind of pinpoint it.
So all these kind of tangible and intangible outcomes, I guess, from having a highly connected volunteer system, volunteer workforce or within your organization is really important. But, I guess the key thing is here is, learning to measure those and making sure that you're measuring them from the outset. Because I just think I'm thinking about an organization I'm working with at the moment that's been going for about 4 years, and we have had a huge amount of voluntary support, which has been fantastic. However, at the very beginning, we didn't start measuring the impact. And now we're getting towards the end of a particular project, and the volunteers are saying, hey, what about me? I did, X amount of hours, or I brought this amount of funding in, or I provided in-kind support by doing this particular piece of work. And a lot of that has got lost because people have moved out of the organization. So I guess having the right management systems in place is really important, Kelly, and doing that right from the outset.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to start measuring kind of whatever inputs you're seeing into your organization, right? Whether that's funds or people or in-kind donations, whatever that is that helps your operation and your kind of business model succeed. It's important that you're taking note and that you have systems that measure that. For us, we are a volunteer management system. The idea is to build capability for organizations that maybe haven't tracked those things historically, didn't understand the value kind of those interventions through volunteers. A good example, I have a sporting client down south. I think might be on the call today. Hello. But, they had kind of one of their regional rugby programs looking at the kind of hourly contributions that their coaches and their managers contribute in a season. And they were really interacting kind of on a very basic level with kind of our tools and just kind of doing that bare basic of what are our volunteers contributing on an hourly basis. At the end of their season, when we had tracked that and they had that kind of, metric in front of them, they were able to see that I think it was something over $100,000 worth of social impact value made in just one season. And they could articulate that. They could put that into a funding application, talking about the value of their people. And I'm trying not to read too many of the questions because I'm excited to answer some of those that are relevant. But thinking through, how do you convert something like volunteer contribution into tangibles like funding or additional people sources. So I'd love to hear your kind of take on that as well, because I think it's a really important thing. It's one, to measure it, and we certainly have some frameworks to be able to support organizations to do that. That is one benefit of technology, is that, you know, as we sophisticate our systems, we're able to kind of call on this information easier. But, you know, then what do you do? And then where do you kind of put that? So I'll let you kind of.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kelly. No, that's a really good point. I think from a funding perspective, how I would then take that data and how I would encourage an organisation to use that can be in a couple of ways. First of all, in terms of actual hours, that's tangible. In a funding application, I think that should be recorded as an organisation's contribution towards a project, or an organisation's contribution to the ongoing operational BAU as part of their business. So it's something that should be a line in the budget that's actually accounted for. I think that's really important to capture that, put a fair monetary value on that, an hourly rate on it based on the skill set that's involved, and put that in as the organisation's contribution towards something. Now, I know that lotteries, in lotteries applications, you've been able to do that. So they have a 2-year limit. Where they'll say, please let us know what's happened over the last, up to 2 years. We want to understand what's been involved from a volunteer perspective. So that's really important. But it should be something that even if the funding organisation's not asking for it, is something that each group should put forward as a contribution. Then there's kind of the intangible outcomes that are hard to kind of measure. So if I think about sport again, one of the rugby clubs that I've been working with recently have done a fantastic job in terms of, yes, they put a whole lot of volunteer hours into coaching and all that kind of stuff, which you expect out of a sports club, but they do so much more. Their volunteers have a mentoring program. They realised really quickly they didn't have enough young players coming into the club. So in order to secure players into the club, they developed a really good volunteer employment pathway program. So the sports club was all about saying, let's retain these players. And the only way, or the best way we can retain them, is by providing jobs and opportunities for them in our community. So they then brought in volunteers to help with that. So they had a very clear employment, mentoring and pathway process. So what was really good about that is when we went to look for funding, yes, we could talk about the sports side of things, but it was much wider than that. We were able to say, it's a sports club, but also actually we've got a role here that we're playing to mentor and provide pathways for young athletes into employment. That opened up a whole range of funders that previously that sporting club could not apply to. So taking measure, once you've got your measurements, it's how do you weave that into a story financially, but also in terms of the intangibles as well. And that makes for a much more compelling case from a funder's perspective.
I think it's that idea too of, can you demonstrate that you have community backing your programs, your interventions? Do you have community support? Do people have buy-in as to what you're offering the community? And a volunteer is a really good example of someone that has or should have buy-in there. Adding on to the skills that they're bringing, that's a really great example of kind of thinking creatively about how your volunteers can position you to solve some problems. We're seeing more and more the desire for volunteers to also have, yes, they want to be, doing their part in their community. Chances are if they're involved with you, they're highly aligned to your values and the kind of causes you support. But we're seeing more and more trends towards individuals also wanting to develop personally, develop professionally, and volunteering is an incredible way to be able to build skills. That's a really great example. Young people, we're not seeing as much in that volunteer space as maybe we'd like. And it's interesting, Volunteer New Zealand put out a report recently talking about, that aging kind of problem and why, there's not more young people. And one of the comments made from a survey respondent was, one, not getting the ask, or are you as an organization asking yourself why we don't want to be involved as a volunteer? I think that's really valuable feedback, is to understanding, what frameworks do you have in place to support your volunteers and their own journey? Is it something like a clear employment pathway? Is it something like deep-rooted connection and culture? Some organizations do that incredibly well. I think, any kind of those mentoring foundations that build that sense of belonging into their programs and their volunteer involvement. But a lot of organizations sometimes struggle with that, and understanding that there's a lot to consider when we involve people. And and the opportunities are endless. We were talking with some of our organizations recently about how do you think about your volunteers creatively, and it's great to talk to you a little bit about that. How do you look at your programs and what you're delivering in the volunteer contributions in a different way? Maybe historically they've had a very traditional kind of exchange with you, but are they also doing things like lifting digital literacy? We are an online platform. We're trying to encourage individuals to get online for the purpose of hopefully maximizing impact and creating more connection. But as an organization, are you supporting in that way and bringing people on board online to do goodwill? Are you thinking about, migrant inclusion and your volunteers and that kind of mentoring programs that can sit there and all that you can be doing to tick boxes for, not just for your organization's values, but potentially funders as well. There's multi-layered benefits that you need to be able to investigate and speak to and think creatively about, we're meeting these needs, and we've never really considered that in our compelling narrative about ourselves. So
yes, it's often overlooked. The other area that I see volunteers playing a really key role from a funding perspective, Kelly, is really in becoming, the ambassador for that particular organization. Often groups we work with, part of what they're trying to do is they're trying to create awareness, not necessarily around the fact that they exist, but it's more really around awareness around the impact that they have in the community. So getting your volunteers on message, having strong communication with your volunteers, and they then become your advocates out in the community. So that can be so good for awareness during a fundraising drive. And also where a number of groups that I've worked with have used their volunteers in a really good way to help bring others on board to help financially support the organization, which, it's, I guess, the more people you tell, and it grows awareness. And so I think the volunteers have got a really good role in that place, but they can only do that if they have the information and if they are feeling nurtured and part of an organization. So they can be the front face of your organization out in the community, but they need to be looked after as well, don't they?
Yeah, I think we've got a lot of synergy in our approach. You were talking about looking after your donors and the importance
yes.
of that. Volunteers 100% the same. Not only do you need to think about their kind of involvement and how that benefits you, but are you looking after your people? Because ultimately they can kind of make or break a reputation as well. And I've seen both sides of that story personally, as a volunteer, as someone who's managed volunteers. And I've certainly been guilty of overlooking those kind of contributions. But we need to think about that concept of burnout, and we need to think about the changes that we're seeing in this space and compared to that economic and social benefit that they bring. So if we're seeing this drop off and slightly less engaged volunteering potentially, how do we reclaim that? How do we retain the people that are great that we do have? Thinking about that burnout and looking after people, I think that it's around 14% of the same people are doing half the volunteer hours in New Zealand. And
gosh,
if we're talking about perpetuating burnout, that is certainly a statistic to rattle you. Something I talk about a lot with my organizations is that feeling of, we're stretched. People don't want to be tapped on the shoulder again for the same programs. And I guess my encouragement to those groups experiencing that and kind of trying to embed a culture of reciprocity and really nurturing, I loved that word that you used, is thinking about, okay, if that's the case and you're continuing to reach out to the same people, can you think a little bit more about how to diversify your opportunities, diversify your networks? Again, synergy there with you. We have such similar kind of perspectives on this. You're hoping for individuals and organizations to diversify their income. Same thing with volunteers. Diversify your volunteer pools. Think about ways to bring people into your organization, whether that's younger people or people that you've potentially just looked over for whatever reason. Maybe they're not first to come to mind. Maybe, the roles that you need to be advertising for, or the ways that you're inviting people to be part of your organization look different than they did 10 years ago. So taking time to think about that and how you look after people, because ultimately, as advocates for you, if they're experiencing things like burnout, if they're not appreciated, if there is no kind of reciprocity in the relationship, ultimately it's not going to benefit your reputation or your sustainability, because those people might be gone in a few years' time. So it's critical.
Yes, burnout is something that I see a lot on a daily basis. We are so lucky to work with the most we work with a wonderful set of highly skilled people. Some are paid, some are volunteers, but they are wearing a lot of hats in small organizations. So sometimes, the one paid person, or if it's run by volunteers, they're everything. They're doing the PR, the comms, the finances, they're the CEO, they're doing employment. And then on top of all of that, they're delivering services into the community. So there is so much burnout. And I guess that point you're making is so important to keep for everybody to make sure that they are looking after and valuing those people, because burnout, and I've noticed it in the last couple of years with fundraising, having been fundraising for 18 years, in the last couple of years the burnout rates are really, really high. And it is tough out there, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think part of I suppose the benefits of technology and the benefits of opening up our networks through an online community, you can potentially open yourself to new volunteer pools that maybe never existed for you 20 years ago. Be Collective has a lot of amazing ways of kind of opening up that recruitment space and thinking differently, whether it's skills-based searches, or maybe you need to start considering am I recruiting based on what I'm used to, or what the potential could be? Are there stay-at-home moms that could be doing virtual contributions to our, organization that maybe just can't physically be present with us? Are there people with disabilities that, again, potentially physically can't devote their time in the same way, but have an amazing offering in a different capacity? And are we kind of designing ways to get involved that support that, so that we can have a bigger, broader, more diverse, more robust group of people pushing us forward and pushing those services along? And technology certainly helps in doing that. I think, the under 35-year-olds do search for any opportunity, whether it's employment, where to go out to eat, volunteering opportunities. They're looking online, and that's different from our kind of aging volunteer population who historically operated word of mouth.
Yes.
Especially in New Zealand, word of mouth is still the leader and how people recruit, but younger people are online. So that's a really good example of thinking about, okay, if we're not using technology in that way, are we missing out? And, it's not the be all end all, but it's certainly important as you're trying to expand your reach, and thinking about opportunities for cross promotion. Online communities are really, really good about spreading the word. I mean, here, like, so many people I've never interacted with before that support your causes and understand and respect you. And so they're coming along to hear, whatever I have to say as well. But it works the same, building those networks and building collaboration and expanding your reach. And that's super, super important for building sustainability. So
yeah, no, really good points, Kelly. One of the things that I've been grappling with a little bit recently is that the world has moved on. So from a funding perspective, it's such a different space than it was to a pre-COVID. It's so different now, and that if organizations are wanting to survive and remain financially sustainable, they kind of have to change the way they're doing things. It's just a different world. It's more competitive. There's less money going around. So what that all means for the groups that I'm working with is probably initially it means more work, which is a bit frightening, because we're dealing with people that are already kind of up to their eyeballs with work. And so then from my perspective, to sort of say, oh, well, on top of everything that you're already doing in your organization, on top of all your voluntary hours, here's some more work to do in the fundraising space, just because you haven't got enough on your plate. So people are, I'm conscious that people are feeling overloaded. But what I have encouraged with my members to do, and this is what I say frequently, is that there is a little bit of upfront extra work, but it's about getting the right systems in place and being quite methodical. And then my view is, and I don't know how this fits from your point of view in terms of what you're doing at Be Collective, but there is a bit of an initial upfront work for sure from a fundraising perspective. If that doesn't happen, it is really unlikely that some of these groups will survive. I'm not talking about groups that I'm working with, but just in general in the charity sector. If organizations can't shift to a more strategic way about thinking about their fundraising, it is likely that, it's going to be much harder for them to remain financially sustainable. So it does mean a bit of extra work. And I'm picking that's possibly the same for groups you work with as well.
It is. And it's probably the thing we talk about the most. And it's a hard one because I've been there. I think, if you've ever been employed in a community organization, nonprofit, you can probably relate to that feeling of overload, overwhelm, being asked to take on a role that maybe you have no idea what you're doing. I certainly wore 10 different hats in organizations, and so I really appreciate it. And it does kind of resonate with me personally. I guess what I would say, and continue to empower organizations as we're kind of working with them on their volunteer strategies and ways of saving time. Our platform is designed to save time, right? There is an initial investment of time up front to think more strategically. That always is the case, whether it's funding, hiring, whatever it might be in your organization. If you want things to move in a positive direction, you need to make an investment. There is an input involved. But the goal and the idea is that over time, that initial investment is going to save you. And so I can think of personally all the ways that I used to operate in roles semi-chaotically, and that, can kind of be the case in a lot of organizations that are lacking resources and staff. However, I would say if you do not have time to carve out for your people or for your funding that are driving your success and your survival, I would ask, what are the things that you are prioritizing? Is there capacity to maybe cut the fat in some places, or reevaluate, is what you're devoting your time to at the moment going to serve you in 10 years, 5 years? What is essential for your survival as an organization? Chances are people are a huge part of that, and funding are a huge part of that. So I guess it's sometimes about shifting priorities, but also accepting that there's a lot of capability building that you can do through volunteers to, again, ease that load if you know where to look for it. We're seeing so much of that corporate kind of excitement around volunteering. Social responsibility is huge at the moment. Corporates in particular are setting more and more targets for themselves and for their staffs to get involved in the community, to have this sense of ownership over their community's outcomes. So thinking through, how can we build our resourcing when we're time poor, when we're lacking funds, when we're feeling overwhelmed. And rather than just having, a team come out and support you for one day's worth of planting, are there actually ways that those kind of other networks can be building up your governance roles, or supporting you in kind of accounting, your social media advertising? There's a lot of creative ways of thinking about volunteering that can save you time if you're willing to use them and tap into those people's skills. I guess that's why skilled volunteering is becoming so much more vital, because we can actually really benefit. We can build our resourcing as an organization by pulling in people with the right skills and matching them to those needs. So it's being strategic and using our time in a really wise way. Again, technology doesn't solve all your problems, but it can simplify processes. I would say a lot of organizations I talk to do not have a strategic onboarding process when it comes to volunteer or their programs. Some do it really well, but a lot, lack a central volunteer database. They lack any kind of understanding of, what are your volunteers' goals, aspirations personally? How do those fit into your organization's trajectory? All of those are really, really valuable and deserve our time and our focus so that we can make sure that our people are aligned with where we're going. And hopefully over time, that really benefits us. So yeah, yes, and a long-winded answer, but to say it does require some upfront investment of your time and your focus, but I think the long-term benefits are huge.
Yeah, I know, I totally agree. And I guess the other thing, so just be interested to hear what you say about this, Kelly, is that I guess if you're pulling volunteers in with different skill sets, then it does reduce it completely would reduce the drain on the small set you have that are there all the time, wouldn't it? So it just helps carry the load. We've just on a project I'm working on for a museum in France, a New Zealand museum in France. We have had we've been so delighted. We've had volunteers that have come in and spent hours doing different aspects of our project. It's meant that our project's been delivered on time, on budget, but bringing in skilled people for certain aspects of the job has been absolutely fantastic. They feel really valued and part of something exciting. But equally, it's reduced the load of some of our other volunteers, and we've learned from the skilled volunteers that have come in. So it's been a really good sharing, I guess, of skills and resources. And that's been fantastic as well.
Yeah, well, people want to be stimulated by their passions. They want to have opportunities to be able to use their expertise. You know, it's great to give your time because you care about a cause. It's even better to give your free time because it lights you up in a way. You know, it makes you feel excited about the connections you're going to have or the mental stimulation, you know. So again, it's about creating relevance for people. Are your volunteers in the right roles in your organization to stay engaged and ultimately, you know, kind of continue to build that success for you? And if not, let's think about ways to bring the right people into the right spaces. You know, something like skills matching in a recruitment platform is really important for that very reason. You know, we want the right people coming into our organizations and kind of performing activities and being part of a culture that really speaks to them and their skills. And then even from a practical point of view, you know, something we need to start thinking about now more than ever, we're seeing a reliance on, you know, service providers that use volunteers to meet needs that, you know, government or, you know, funders maybe aren't able to meet at the moment. You were talking about that kind of change in that landscape there. So if we're relying on our service providers locally to meet our needs, volunteers are going to be really important in resourcing those projects. I think of a good example of that skilled volunteering. You know, we're working constantly with disaster response. You know, we've got quite a few clients in Australia. They've been dealing with bushfires, with floods. You know, obviously here in Hawke's Bay, we just had Cyclone Gabriel, which was, you know, I'm sure you had your own personal experience of that. I certainly did. You know, what we saw was community acting first and foremost. You know, even before local government, community was out there with their tractors in my backyard. You know, my husband saved someone on a jet ski, but you see community really shine in that space, led by volunteers. So I think disaster relief is also a clear picture of where we're going to need to be strategic about how we deal with our people. How can we make sure that we've got systems and frameworks in place where our skilled volunteers are ready to go, that we have kind of a good sense of what those people's expertise areas are. They can be ready to be deployed at any point. You know, not every example is going to be in relationship to disaster response, but it's certainly a present and very crucial one at the moment. It's another reason I kind of harp on having these volunteer systems in place and frameworks to support your ongoing administration of volunteers, because there may be a time where you really need these people and have them on hand, you know, that you can be training and preparing them for whatever that activity is in, you know, a year's time. It was something that maybe we could have done better in this last year. I was amazed at the kind of work that happened at the kind of community locally here. Porongaho was amazing.
They were.
It's really, really, it invigorated my spirit to see people respond that way. But I know that they were really in need of skilled individuals to come in and take care of some of those massive infrastructure issues. Would have really benefited to have, you know, even more organizations have those groups prepared and ready and organized. So I think we're seeing that more and more. Certainly for our clients in Australia, we're working on some really exciting projects there where they're using these systems and Be Collective is supporting those efforts. So all that to say, you know, it's important to be, you know, really intentional about your volunteer effort, and especially in that skilled space. Yeah, no,
I totally agree. I was just thinking about another project that I've been working on recently where we have had quite a few corporates, so sort of larger corporates, come on board. We've had KPMG, PwC, Main Freight, some of the bigger corporates have come on board and have volunteered and done an amazing amount of work. And looking after them and recognizing their contribution is absolutely huge. So I think, you know, if you have got volunteers coming on board, so for my funding HQ members out there, if you've got volunteers coming on board, whether they be individual people or they're corporates or businesses or philanthropic trusts that are coming and doing extra over and beyond, make sure that you're measuring them is really important. Main Freight's a really good example. They've just shipped our Weta workshop production across to France for the opening of the museum. we've looked after them, we're recognizing them as they're there as a donor and a partner to the project. They've unpacked this amazing exhibition, and to have the chief executive of Don Braid ring our trust to say our volunteers have, their voluntary contribution has just been so beneficial for them, and they've loved being part of it. That's important. You've got to measure that, don't you?
Yeah, 100%.
And it's and make them feel special and part of your project.
Yes.
Yeah, I know on that particular project, if we didn't have the corporates, it would have been very difficult to get the project over the line. So corporate volunteering is important. But I guess in saying that, it's also remembering that if you have got businesses that are coming on board to support you on a voluntary basis, they also have boards to report back to. They have owners to report back to. They've got the community to report back to. So making sure that that you can measure the impact that they have made and help them tell their story is really important, isn't it?
It's huge. I mean, we're seeing, major players, big banks, big corporates come out with like these massive targets, right, for community engagement, sustainability. They've got social responsibility teams now that didn't even used to exist, however many years ago. And they've got massive accountability there, staring them in the face. So we can actually support that as well, because we know that if we've got some of our massive operators working towards a sustainable future, working towards healthier communities, they have a huge potential impact. But they can also, be fueling these little organizations that have been here and been in the trenches for years and years. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we can use those individuals, we can use those larger corporations and their goals to kind of continue to drive, our needs. It can be that symbiotic relationship. And I guess that's why I love the idea of what we refer to as community infrastructure. Yes, we are software, but what we're trying to do is build that kind of ecosystem where, corporates can come in and support those smaller organizations, and vice versa. Their engagement with those community level projects can then feed back into some of those sustainability targets that they've got. And it really, really works symbiotically and mutually beneficial for the people involved. But when we're also thinking about, recognizing their contributions, often it's not just a monetary investment that you can be asking your corporate or local business partners. I'm reading some questions about, how do we actually translate this into funds? And I guess what's important to also consider as you're bringing in business and corporates into your volunteer space, there is opportunities for them to have buy-in on so many different levels. Yes, you would love to have a financial contribution from a corporate, but even better if you can also have their people really invested in the success of your programs. I saw that locally. Actually, we had in one of the youth development programs I worked in, one of our corporate sponsors, yes, they gave to us financially per annum, but they started actually coming alongside our mentorship programs and were 100% invested in these kids' lives. And I guess that is the goal, right? We want people to have buy-in on all these various levels. And the more and more kind of, value that they're experiencing firsthand, the more drive there's going to be to continue to support your organization in the future. So I think it's also about, again, diversifying their experience. Yes, it's great if they can give funds, but if they can't, don't stop there. Allow them to still come in and provide people pro bono services, whatever that might be that they can provide, in-kind resources. Maybe they've got a van that they can drive, whatever it is. Don't pass up those opportunities to really build up your resources with some of those corporate relationships or even local businesses, because they can be massively significant for those that are, in need.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Kelly. It really is. And it's just thinking a bit more laterally, isn't it, around contributions into your organisation. I'm just conscious of time, and we've got quite a few questions, so I'll just whip through the questions with you, if that's okay. So Holly, thanks for your questions. So Holly's wondering, are younger generations volunteering less? Is that what you're saying? Her impression is that younger generations are more socially minded, but maybe they're less keen on doing extra work. Do you know what factors are at play?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. And kind of various reports across countries will maybe say different things, but certainly in New Zealand, that contribution isn't being reported on. So it could also be a lack of data. But in reality, I think young people more than ever are stretched in the kind of societal expectations they're dealing with, university, sport, high performance. Certainly, I mean, I grew up in the States, and that was enormous pressure on young people to succeed at an early age. They're dealing with the kind of incoming recession, whatever their reasons might be. It's important for us to actually find out the why. So rather than me being able to kind of answer and kind of on behalf of young people, certainly we're hearing from our community organizations and survey and data across New Zealand, Volunteering New Zealand, DIA's recent support on kind of volunteering all talks about, not having the same statistic representation in those younger groups. I have a feeling, just from kind of the conversations that I've had, young people are feeling a lot of pressure to be eligible in the workforce. They want skills that translate to that employment space.
Yes.
Volunteering is an amazing way to do that, but there's often, a little bit of a struggle in being able to articulate that. That's one thing that I really love about the opportunity to go online and having kind of a skills-based, framework and platform is there is so much gain in volunteering. We know that, not beyond just connection and well-being, there are hard and soft skills that you're gaining by, your kind of commitment to a cause and an organization. I know for me personally, that was true. I developed so much of my leadership skills in that voluntary capacity. But I think young people, especially those that maybe haven't ever had to translate their skills into something like a CV, they might need a little bit of help articulating what is my worth, what am I good at? We have something, and it's probably my favorite thing that we offer kind of within our platform, is this idea of a social record. So allowing people to track their journeys and their kind of involvement in the voluntary space and actually see the skills and experience gained along that journey. They can have something that we refer to as a social CV auto-generated for them. And so they're able to kind of interact with the goodwill that they're doing, but even they have opportunities to have direct testimonials. They can see, what are the causes that they've invested the most time in, things like this to support young people and understanding that, yes, you want to volunteer and support your community because that allows our communities to thrive. But there's also a lot individually that you can gain and that you can grow in by doing so. And here's how to articulate that and translate that into, further development. So, whether the reasons are because it's a competitive, kind of landscape for young people and they're worried about work, I can't speak to that exactly. It's worth us investigating the why and asking them whys. So if you're already asking the young people around you, what would engage you in getting involved with an organization, and really running with that.
Good point. Yeah. Thanks, Kelly. The next question we've got in, what we factor our volunteer hours into funding applications at $30 per hour. Interested to know what others do. My sort of rule of thumb when I'm talking to organisations about how they record volunteer hours is it depends on the type of skill that's being measured. So for instance, if you've got someone that's sort of doing administration, I'd probably $30 to $35 an hour is probably about right. If you've got someone coming in to give you, quite highly specialized, engineering advice or architectural advice or curatorial advice, depending what your project is, then I think it would be, that needs to probably a higher rate. But for sort of BAU on support, ground support, that to me sounds about right, Robin. But I don't know what you think, Kelly.
Yeah, I mean, it varies country to country. We see this figure kind of shift. And we've talked a little bit earlier about social return on investment and kind of evaluating volunteer impact. A little bit, it can be challenging. Disparity around that is certainly at play. Defining outcomes and defining impact can be somewhat subjective. In New Zealand, there's not a standardized kind of metric for valuing volunteers. But I know for us, we have historically used that kind of idea of a living wage times the kind of hours contributed as a basic formula for that. And I believe that's how Australia operates as well. But again, you can speak to the financial, a kind of a rough picture of what those skills are valued at in the market. But then you can add to that, right? Because they're also going to be adding to other elements. They're not just showing up, probably not just showing up and offering, an admin skill. They're adding to culture. They might be adding to your, your vision, and they might be in multiple roles where they're bringing various skills. So there's a lot of ways to talk about that value, but that is kind of the standard that we've been working on. And until there's a mechanism for kind of a universal mechanism for measuring, I think it's a good starting point.
Yes, yeah, no, really good. Another question we've got in here, Kelly, is just around volunteer hours into a funding application. This is probably a question for me, because if they're offering their time for free, you can't apply for funding for them. That's correct. So yes, you can't apply for funding if they're volunteers. So you just got to make sure you don't do that. But what you can do, Denica's come back, and that you're right. Volunteers show an organisation is delivering projects on completing tasks without having to pay for full-time headcount. This means dollars can be spent and how the organisation is resourceful, extending services and impact to the community. So yes, that's right. What I would do in those situations is I would record the in-kind support given by your volunteers, measure it, record it, and then I would look for funding, not for salary costs, but you're just saying we've met our salary costs. This is part of our contribution to the project, but we are still looking for funding for any other aspects that are still outstanding. So whether that's marketing costs, or whether that's your rent or your photocopying machine, or whatever the other things that you need to get funding for. But I guess the key point here is that you can't kind of double dip, and I know Holly wouldn't be thinking about that, but it's good to sort of clarify that.
Yeah.
That's the question for you, Kelly, is around, do you encourage organisations to have sort of agreements or contracts with volunteers? Is that something that Be Collective recommend or not?
Yeah. So, in terms of a contract, that really depends on the organization. We certainly have capacity to support compliance, and we encourage that. It's one of the biggest oversights in organizations when it comes to volunteers or in participation in general, is how do we look after compliance and kind of our due diligence when it comes to things like integrity, agreements, codes of conduct, whatever that might be within your organization. It's going to become increasingly more important that we have airtight systems around that. So we certainly have capacity to support that with doc storage and kind of the building of your applications within our platform. I encourage there to be expectation setting. That's just me personally. And I think it is really important to have clear volunteer strategies and policies in place, not just to protect the organization, but to protect your volunteers. Again, it's a relationship that you want to be, really positive and long lasting, and to avoid things like burnout, to promote healthy, environments, whether that's kind of the volunteer experience or the kind of recipients of that community organization's interventions, whoever is involved in at play. It's important to set expectations for volunteers and organizations to be on the same page about what those expectations are. And so that could be something as important as, working with children's kind of conduct. Could be, what's appropriate in terms of an hourly commitment for a volunteer to avoid things like burnout. So yes, I mean, there's certainly capacity to build those within our system. From a kind of advisory standpoint, I do advise that there's something in place that identifies what your relationship's going to look like. It's all about just building that kind of healthy relationship. And hopefully you see this more and more. Some organizations, do it really, really well, but I think it's better not to have ambiguity.
I agree. It's really good, because it's really good. Often people start in an organization and the energy's high and everyone's excited. And that, as pressure comes on, it can wane a bit. And, I know in a fundraising space, there's highs and lows. So it's good to be very clear from the outset, isn't it?
Yeah. And not so much to bind someone, but again, to be very clear about what you're hoping to see in that space. And volunteers have expectations as well when they come into an organization, and maybe sometimes they're not verbalized, and that can be, a barrier in that retention. So again, speaking up towards, what do I want to experience out of this as a volunteer? what do I hope to gain? Those are really valuable insights that you can capture in something like an application for recruitment. I see this a lot. We work with organizations a lot about being strategic in their basic kind of recruitment practices. How are you talking about, welcoming people into your organization? What are the kinds of questions you want to ask them to make sure that, one, you're setting, you're demonstrating what you're about and what you hope this person will contribute to, but also that they have a clear picture, for themselves, so they can determine, is this right for them? So yeah, absolutely. And then when we talk about, contracts outside of just the volunteer relationship, certainly support organizations being on the ball about compliance and storing documentation when it comes to volunteer contribution. Yeah.
Oh no, that's great, Kelly. We've got one more question, which is around, do you see a place for sponsorship and a funding plan for a volunteer centre? Considering diversifying our funding plan to include this, but not sure how to approach. Absolutely. So Angela, yeah, absolutely. Looking for sponsorship, looking for a corporate sponsorship to come in and support your volunteer centre is a fantastic idea. You should definitely look at doing that. This is an opportunity. Sometimes from a sponsorship thing, it's actually helping a sponsor look really good, and help, as we've talked about today, Kelly, helping a corporate say, hey, this is the impact we're having in our community. We're working this group. So yep, I would definitely encourage you to think about that. With corporate partnerships and sponsorships, it does give you a bit more flexibility around where you spend the money. You get so much more out of it than you do out of an application-based approach to fundraising, because you're bringing people in. You're potentially bringing another business in. They will hopefully have other staff that might want to get involved and be part of your volunteer team. So it's kind of a win-win.
Yeah, and even better, I think, just kind of piggybacking on everything we've said, even better if you can provide that anecdotal evidence of the kind of wonderful things you're doing. But if you've got also those metrics that you've been tracking alongside, I know personally, having made some kind of financial asks in the past, I was underprepared in my kind of pitch and being able to talk about, what are the resources we have as an organization? What does the community involvement and the volunteer contribution look like? They care about that just as much as a government grant might. So
yes,
also,
that's right.
Making sure that ask is sophisticated in that way, and that you've done your due diligence and understanding the various aspects that make your organization work and exactly the kind of needs that hopefully they can fulfill. But yeah, I think in terms of a volunteer center too, man, in New Zealand, we've got 17 across New Zealand, and all of them I know have similar struggles with keeping volunteers and keeping funding really rich and robust. It's a challenge. So would be great to really diversify their relationships and hopefully lean into some of those, local businesses or corporate relationships even more. Certainly.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just conscious about time, Kelly. Our hour's gone so quickly. I think from my perspective, what I believe is, if organizations are wanting to really value the volunteers and to value volunteers, to make sure that their organizations are really thinking strategically about the volunteers and the impact that they have. If they are wanting to be smart with the fundraising that they're doing, it's really important to value your volunteers. It's also important to put systems in place to look after them, and it's also important that you measure the impact that they have. So from my perspective, Be Collective is a fantastic tool to do that, and I would really encourage and will be encouraging my Funding HQ members to check out Be Collective, because for me it's a no-brainer. And I think the projects I've been involved with over the last 18 years in fundraising, had we had a platform like Be Collective right from the beginning to really be able to manage and to look after our volunteers and the various projects it would have been a game changer from a funding perspective, but also from an organizational perspective in terms of how you look after people and you value people, and you keep your organization sustainable. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing some of your knowledge today, because I think it's, for groups that are wanting to be really serious about their fundraising, it's a no-brainer to look after volunteers.
Yeah.
And so encourage you also to check out Be Collective. We're going to send out a copy of this webinar so that you can share it amongst your organization. And Kelly and I are happy to be contacted afterwards if you have any questions. Yeah, so thank you everyone for your time. And Kelly, especially big thanks to you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I mean, echoing everything you're saying, you know, I just really, really, respect your wisdom in this space. And I know that my networks, my clients are going to be dying to kind of continue to pick your brain. I think some of them were asking those questions. And so I know the value that you bring to New Zealand and that funding space and how, you know, important it is for organizations to take these things seriously. So likewise, you know, I know that there's so much wisdom you have to offer in your team as well. So thank you for letting us, you know, be a part of your little kind of, you know, online community, and hopefully, you know, future collaborations. Love that. Please, anyone that has questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. If there's any kind of resources that we can offer, you know, we talked about a few statistics and things. If you have questions about where those came from or any kind of advice that you might want to explore or whatever that looks like, please, we are open books. So do get in touch, and thank you so much for your time. I know it's a busy week for everybody, so appreciate that.
Thanks, Kelly. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Goodbye.